Good evening. Welcome to the Fales Library. I'm Marvin Taylor. I'm the director here at Fales, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to a reading for the opening of At Times Like This, He Feels Farthest Away. Before we get the reading going, though, I want to thank Philip Monaghan, without whom this couldn't have taken place. I think that he's expressed incredible generosity in helping us put together this show, and the passion to complete this really fascinating work, this collaboration with Tim Dlugos. Tim's papers are here in Fales. If any of you didn't know, that's why it's very appropriate that this work should be put here. Plus the fact that NYU reneged on actually installing it almost 30 years ago. So I'm really glad that it could take place here. And also for what I think perhaps people could describe as Philip's characteristic tenacity in installing this. But please join me in thanking Philip. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce David Trinidad, whose papers are also here in Fales, who's a poet and editor, an extraordinary teacher, and who's working on and is about to have published the collected poems of Tim Dlugos. Please join me in welcoming David. Thank you.
And I just wanted to announce that Tim's book, A Fast Life, The Collected Poems of Tim Dlugos, is being published very shortly this spring by Night Boat Books. And there will be a gala publication reading for the book at the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church on Wednesday, May 11th. And many of Tim's friends and admirers will be reading from the book. Tonight, three of Tim's friends, myself, Eileen Myles, and Brad Gooch, will read poems from the book. Eileen and I will read poems from early in Tim's career, and Brad will read some of his later poems. There's a bio of Tim right outside the door, but I'll just read a little of it here. Tim Dlugos was a prominent younger poet who was active in both the mass transit poetry scene in Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s and New York's downtown literary scene in the late 70s and 80s. His books include Je Suis Ein Americano, Entre Nous, and Strong Place. He died of AIDS on December 3rd, 1990 at the age of 40. When I was editing Tim's work, I fell in love with his poems from the early and mid-70s, many of which had never been published. And I'll read a few of my favorites. The first three are untitled. Who will have whom in the next life? Will we all be stars with satellites? I can only speak for Friday, when snow dropped on our rhinestones and Liza Minnelli, and we were together for evening's sake. Nicotiana sensation will bloom every night in the sour front yard that has not yielded a single strand of grass, according to Burpee, the seed magnet. Forget the past, he tells us. Trust moonflowers. Here is the blonde world of Sunday morning, white pine furniture, your lemon robe. I am wearing yesterday's shirt, and we are drinking morning tea. It's all very hazy and golden, and nobody's speaking anywhere I can hear. We have entered the silent dimension. Sun keeps rising while I am a denim boy, and oh, you are blonde. Two things a star wouldn't do: masturbate, write this. Incredible risks. I take incredible risks with my poems, which is why they always turn out so fine. After a line by Ted Berrigan, I want Pepsi for breakfast every day. Every time I look out the window, I want to see Sheridan Square. The lights have to be just right. I want to look as good as Carol, Jim, and write as good as Berrigan, Ted. I want to seem gentle and wear leather clothes. The things you might suppose I want, I probably don't. For instance, dope. I can be totally carried away by a face in the city, a line in a poem. The moment at my parents' home, for instance, when I saw that phrase again and sat up straight. I have been in bed, I said, in my lover's underwear long enough. I want to be feminine, marvelous, and tough. Under the sky. We were supposed to have gone to the mountains, but I stayed asleep, and it was too late to leave by the time I woke up and called you. It started to rain. All of our plans went out the window into the trees with their tiny leaves and the parking lot. I watched a movie and fell asleep with a headache which hung on when I reawoke. It was too late to call and explain, so I walked to my car and drove through the rain to your building. The moon was perfectly full. The sky was perfectly clear. This is the poem responsible for our being here tonight, and it seems a little strange to read it since Tim is reading it endlessly out in the hallway, but I will. Gilligan's Island. The professor and Ginger are standing in the space in front of the skipper's cabin. The professor is wearing deck shoes, brushed denim jeans, and a white shirt open at the throat. Ginger is wearing spike heels, false eyelashes, and a white satin kimono. The professor looks at her with veiled lust in his eyes. He raises an articulate eyebrow and addresses her as Cho-Cho-san. Ginger blanches and falls on her knife. Meanwhile, it is raining in Northern California. In a tiny village on the coast, Rod Taylor and Tippi Hedren are totally concerned. They realize that something terrible is happening. Each has been savagely attacked by a wild songbird within the last 24 hours. Outside their window, thousands of birds have gathered in anticipation of the famous schoolyard scene. Tippi Hedren is wearing a colorful lipstick. Ginger stares back at the professor. His sullen good looks are the perfect foil for her radiant smile. The skipper and Gilligan come into sight. The skipper has been chasing Gilligan around the lagoon for a long time now. Gilligan holds onto his hat in the stupid way he has of doing things like that. The professor's lips part in a sneer of perfect contempt. Ginger bares her teeth as if in appreciation. Jackie Kennedy bares her teeth. Behind and above her, the muzzle of a high-powered rifle protrudes from a window. A little man is aiming at Jackie Kennedy's husband. The man is wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. There isn't a bird to be seen. As he squeezes the trigger, the little man mutters between clenched teeth, "Certs is a candy mint." The hands of Jackie Kennedy's husband jerk automatically toward his head. The professor is noticing Ginger's breasts. He thinks of the wife he left at home, who probably thinks he's dead. He thinks of his mother and all of the women he has ever known. Mr. and Mrs. Howell are asleep in their hut, secure in their little lives as character actors. Ginger shifts her weight to the other foot. The intensity of the moment reminds the professor of a Japanese city before the end of the war. In his mind, he goes down each aisle in his government class, focusing on each face, each body. He is lying on his bed with his white shirt off and his trousers open. Dorothy Kirsten's voice fills the room. He settles on a boy who sits 2 desks behind him. He begins to masturbate, his body moving in time with the sad music. At moments like these, he feels farthest away. As he shoots, his lips part and he bares his teeth. The professor and Ginger are watching each other across the narrow space. The skipper and Gilligan have disappeared down the beach. The Howells are quietly snoring. The professor and Ginger are alone. From the woods comes the sound of strange birds. From the water comes a thick and eerie tropical silence. The famous conversation scene is about to start. Clouds appear in the sky, and it begins to snow. And lastly, at the point, It is after midnight. Your fat friend decides to go swimming. He takes off all his clothes. The headlights of a car flash, illuminate his body as he moves down the road toward the beach. The boy you are in love with lights a joint. You both are at the end of the boardwalk. Smoke rises into the intense blue sky from his mouth. His papers are covered with stars. You actually ache with the desire to touch the man in bed beside you. He is on the college faculty. You are one of his brightest students. It takes you a long time to get back to sleep. There are 2 houses. The big one is filled with your friends who are going away. There is a piano in the tiny house. You walk into the empty parlor, sit down, and play the only song you know by heart. Eileen Myles.
Hi. This whole thing is so amazing because, you know, those of us who are friends with Tim, and I guess that's most of the people in the room, I mean, are just continually shocked by how endlessly cute and young Tim keeps being, you know, and keep getting younger and younger every time we see another picture of him or there's another Tim event. I don't know, I just want to, Philip's, the paintings, the work is so great, and you know, I just want to celebrate David for just time and again and over all this time, like just, you know, protecting the work and putting it together and making it so that Tim's work life just keeps being available, and it's just such an incredible, arduous, poetic thing to do for a friend and for all of us. So it's so great. Hey, David. And you know, and why you for protecting all, you know, the papers and everything. And Brad and I were joking. I was like, "Where are your papers?" We're like in a storage bin in California in a file cabinet someplace in my apartment. But we're safe too, especially because we're alive. That helps. That's like, you can bring them to another storage bin. So I'm going to read a poem of Tim's called A Fast Life, which is from what year, David? 74, 75. It's very funny because they're sort of sonnet-ish. They're like 15-line sonnets, which is so perversive, Tim. They're sort of sonnets, not sonnets, I think. And so I'm just going to skip around through a bunch of. I'll read the first and the last and a few in between. And the only it's funny that he mentions in it that thing where he mentions a night in which he had the choice of going to an Auden reading or a Ron Padgett reading, and he took Padgett, which is so funny. But odd too, because Tim was in a certain way of that. I mean, when I think of New York school poets, I think of him, at least a lot of the body of work is most like Schuyler and being kind of like such a novelish. He mentions in here also just like there's a moment where he talks about a novel that he planned to write, and the Tim that I knew never ever made a move to write any kind of novel, and maybe he did, but we don't know that and stuff. But the thing that's so funny is that the poetry is such a novel of a certain kind of life, and that people like Auden and Isherwood and Schuyler are a part of a certainly gay male lineage, you know, which is kind of, I mean, Tim was all kinds of files, but definitely an Anglophile, and so it's so funny that he would nonetheless go hear Padgett, which is A Fast Life. I thought I was incapable of love the year I left the brothers' novitiate. My father thought that I should live at home. Alfred thought he'd like to get to know me better when he saw me walk across campus. My first roommate thought that I was into heavy drugs. Rob thought I was a hippie when I told him I was living in a commune. My freshman history and senior writing teachers thought I was their finest student. Everybody thought that I should get my degree. My academic counselor thought I had the wrong priorities. The nun who taught me Renaissance painting thought I was a sensitive person leading a fast life. When Marty said he couldn't take me seriously, I cried. He had studied at the Institute of Man in Pittsburgh before he became director of Formation. The Institute was popular with people who were serious about their religious lives. Marty was upset when I skipped a night of recollection to attend a memorial service for the Kent State students. I found myself in trouble when I introduced my girlfriend to the whole community. It was whispered I was really sleeping with men. After I came out, I left the brothers, expecting to feel a sense of relief, but I didn't feel anything. I followed Jim O'Toole back to his dorm after an honors dinner. In the recreation room, I met Patty. We started a conversation that lasted all night and watched the sun come up from my apartment balcony. 1 week later, we slept together for the first time, both of us wearing jeans and thick sweaters. He always gets the outfit right. And I was like, Lee Harvey Oswald, right? That was such an amazing detail that he had jeans and a white T-shirt. Patty led an active social life, and many other men were attracted to her. Some of them had strange names like Dusty and Bob the Shrink. This was my first romance with a woman, and I thought I was a lucky man. I was still a brother at the time, and I wanted to help redefine the meaning of religious community. Patty wanted to study in Switzerland more than anything else. I met Diana Rigg backstage after she played Eloise to Keith Mitchell's Abelard. She autographed my program. 2 hours later, I met Rob in a bar uptown. He invited me to spend the night with him at the Plaza Hotel, and I said, okay, not even knowing his name. That was the most grace-filled moment in my life. I met Richard Wilbur when he read at LaSalle and thought his work was overrated. He wore a tweed jacket with suede patches on the sleeves, which I described as his uniform. I almost met Ramsey Clark at a political dinner once. I introduced myself to Ron Padgett in 1970 at the Philadelphia Y, but was too shy to start a conversation. One summer, I taught algebra and U.S. history at my former high school. I coached an intramural basketball team and took 2 of my freshmen to a rock concert in Atlantic City. I sought and received psychiatric help another summer. I worked at the Washington Navy Yard and ate lunch every day in the CIA cafeteria. The summer after that, I was in love with Rob. I would leave work on Friday and not return from New York until the following Wednesday. I am still amazed that I could get away with that. Another year, I had a job in Provincetown, but came back after a week. I saw Death in Venice in New York at a theater near Carnegie Hall. By the end, the audience was actually hissing, and I was speechless at their lack of perception at the movie's beauty. Outside, Rob was waiting in the strong sunlight. He was wearing a T-shirt and faded jeans. His effortless beauty hit me hard when I saw him there. I identified my feelings with Dirk Bogarts in the film. Only thought I was more fortunate since I could give my feelings a name. That was the first time I was really in love with another human being. I was very fond of the idea of being in love in New York, too. Chateau Neuf du Pape at La Terrasse each winter, the deaths of brothers David Darst and David Ryan, Robert Lowell's confessional poems. I wish he'd stopped at For the Union Dead. After such knowledge, what forgiveness, and a couple of other expressions. Afternoons at Smith's Bar or the Hideaway Lounge with Alfred and Sri Rao, choosing to hear Ron Padgett instead of Wystan Auden when they read the same night. The novels of Jonathan Strong, the weak distinction of never seeing a game in a basketball-happy college. Bourbon and Cokes and Rum Collinses, neither of which I drink much anymore, and opening my heart to the influence of the moment, all used to mean more to me than they do now. When I was 21, I wanted to write a novel about the year I was 20. It would be called The Last Revolving Year, after a Joni Mitchell song. In the novel, I would move into my first apartment with the man who was to be my lifelong closest friend. I would have my first love affair with a sensitive woman, then fall in total love with a beautiful boy. The novel was to end on my 21st birthday, the climax of my difficult transition from late adolescence to adulthood. The story was based entirely on facts. I hope to write a series of sequels describing my further growth. Alfred had his freshmen up for sherry 2 or 3 times a week. I disliked most of them. Most of all, I disliked Tim. Alfred was in love with him. Tim's fiancée would visit him a lot. They'd met at high school in Bel Air, Maryland. Tim liked to dominate the space around himself, and so did I. 1 year later, we finally made love after joking about it for a long time on the floor of Alfred's office while he was in class. We both felt incredibly guilty over that. It was the first of many times. In the house on Pulaski Avenue, Ken sat in the 3rd floor window seat, drinking crabberry from the bottle and crying over Joni Mitchell. Alfred's brother lived with us during the week. His wife accused me of sleeping with boys, but not to my face. Tom stayed over when he could. I got my first case of crabs, which I tried to cure with lemon up. It didn't work. The president of my high school class spent a weekend. We ended up in bed, my most tender memory of that year. Ken was in love with a gorgeous but unapproachable swimmer. I slept with Tom the night my cousin died. A kid I had been cruising for weeks finally started a conversation one weekend. It was 1 year after my coming out, and I expected something equally auspicious to occur. He was a student at medical school, and he asked me home with him. The first thing that I saw in his apartment was a photo on the mantel that looked exactly like me, down to the mustache and glasses. It was his former lover with whom he'd broken up the previous week. I felt glad to be there. We stayed awake all night, though neither of us came. Next morning was Palm Sunday. That's so Tim. What's like? I walked to the cathedral where I met Alfred for High Mass. The cardinal walked in the procession. I have a hard time writing about Michael, even though I haven't seen him for a long time. When I heard a song about the love that I thought could save me a couple of days ago, his face flashed into my mind. I felt that way about him, even though I didn't and don't believe that love can save anything outside the immediate moment. The night before he left for Europe, we drove along the river. I didn't say the same things I usually didn't say, and wondered as usual what he was feeling. Michael had amazing eyes, and I kept looking across the seat at him, taking my eyes off the road. I remember every detail of that ride. Later on, I wrote some poems to him which, like my feelings, were out of control. I still find it impossible to say with any grace what his presence meant. Even though we stayed pretty close, there were difficult moments in my friendship with Tim. There was one dramatic scene on the steps when he handed me the keys to his car and said he would see me tomorrow. I had expected us to go home together. For some reason I have forgotten, I was totally crushed and thought, it's all over now. I drove around the city with Ray until nearly dawn, babbling and crying. It was a cold night, and neither of us could locate the heater in Tim's VW. After nearly freezing, we found an all-night service station on Chestnut Hill. The pump attendant thought we were playing a joke on him when we asked for help. I got picked up at the after-hours bar rather suddenly by someone attractive who was obviously stoned. We went to the Savoy for coffee before going back to his apartment, and I could see he was totally out of things. But I thought, what the hell? At his apartment, I lay in his bed for what seemed like an hour while he washed his dishes, folded laundry, etc. Finally, he climbed in beside me, gave me a tentative kiss, and said, okay, now you can fuck me. This made me laugh, which he found pretty annoying. The next day, we walked through Center City together. We both had a really good time. Pat and I broke up after one stormy Sunday when I took him to Lautrec for breakfast, and he walked out when he learned that they served caviar rather than bacon and eggs. The same night I met Spinner. That was my shortest interval ever between relationships. We danced to every slow song at the PBL for 4 hours straight. A whiter shade of pale played many times. I called him every night that week. We had a date for Lady Sings the Blues on Saturday night and acted like strangers when we met at the speed line. Neither of us could remember how the other one looked. I made 4.0 my first semester at LaSalle and received a notice of total scholarship. 3 years later, my love light had caught up with my intellectual growth and the money stopped coming in. The vice president for academic affairs said I should be doing better. I moved into a room on the top floor of a decaying house, my first time living alone. Each morning I would make a cup of strong coffee and sit in my bed for hours with a typewriter in my lap, writing poems. Most of them were not that great. I dropped most of my courses in November. I said school was a drain on my energy. I wanted to concentrate on my writing. When the radical priest was fired, I wanted to help him pioneer an alternative ministry. I wanted to unionize students in the state of Pennsylvania. I wanted to do postgraduate work at NYU in 20th century studies, at Iowa in writing, and at the University of Leeds in aesthetic theory. I wanted to be living with Alfred when we both were very old. I visualized our apartment with many books and records. I wanted to sleep with Michael, but never did. I wanted to establish the Poet/City Workshop in a storefront on Germantown Avenue. I wanted to be living in New York near all the famous poets I admired. I wanted to be famous myself, and still do.
later poems of Tim. I was just talking about Frank O'Hara at the Museum of Modern Art before I came here, and the line at O'Hara's wasn't just a line. At O'Hara's funeral, where Philip Guston's walking out and puts his arm around Joe Lesueur, O'Hara's longtime roommate, and says he was our Apollinaire. And I always thought that Tim was like our Frank O'Hara. That was I mean, I think we were always trying to be somebody else, and but he was successful at Frank O'Hara, I thought at the time. And then he transcended himself, which is the impression I get reading this book, into these later poems. I don't know how he did them. First, I'm going to read a poem that was dedicated to me, called Close, which is a pun, close, but also close. The backstory being that we shared a therapist, Sister Mary Michael Simpson, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is weird. And so the waiting room was the cathedral close, this yard outside, and Tim was after me, so he obviously made better use of his time and wrote this poem. And the backstory is the poem is a sestina, and I'd written a sestina, or a few of them, one from 3 until 10 in the morning about a gay bar, and so Tim he sort of topped me, because before there were neo-formalists, there was Tim Dlugos, who does more with the sestina than I did. So the sestina is using these same last words, then re-scrambled in the next stanza. His words, love, new, close, stories, shall, and blue, except he does this thing of using every so often the word that just rhymes with the word at the end of the line and things that I hadn't thought of. Close. Spring peaks, the 3rd of May, the feast of love. Cherry flowers old, magnolias new. Peahens chase tots in the cathedral close. We share a therapist, up there 3 stories. I'm here to recollect, and recollect I shall. But first, let me get over this amazing blue of sky, above new green of leaves and blue of polyester running shoes. I love to think it's something absolutely new, this light and weather, like my summer clothes. But they predate us both, say histories, pretending it's the first time as a shell game. Can't beat demon time, they say, though Shelley disagreed. The rains came, the winds blew, and swamped his tiny boat. I'm not in love with impiety, just with youth. The new world is a-comin', old draws to a close. A row of vignettes pasted on a storyboard by young go-getters with success stories and saleable today, beneath the sheltering deciduous to kids in blue jeans, teenaged like the leaves, amazed by love that sprouts like sudden flowers on their new embarrassed shapes. Their childhood's at a close, a time they thought the doors would never close behind them or before them, as in stories on Time Tunnel or Twilight Zone. They shall learn differently. It used to make me blue to think of it, but now it makes me love great days like this one with a giddy new intensity. It is completely new, this light, that 5-year-old with his fat closed-mouthed nurse, that row of petals 3 stories above my head where you are, and they shall never be quite the same again. The blue sky either, or you, or I. That's why love makes all things new, beats history. This blooming close opens my shell to love to you. Also, I noticed that Tim starts to sort of brag about his poetic powers more in these later poems, and it seems accurate. I mean, they seem to have increased, so he was just, observing. So that's just the truth. Every time I use my language, I tell the truth. A cat in a white collar, like a priest with calico fur, walks across the dead grass of the yard and out through the white fence. The sun's strong, but the colors of the lawn were washed out by the winter, not the light. February, stained glass window of the house next door takes the sun's full brunt. It must look spectacular to the neighbor in my head, a white-haired woman with an air of dignity and grace, who, through pools of the intensest colors, climbs the flight of stairs. I've never seen it, but I know it's there. So part of what seemed daring in these was that he was going to seminary and then writing poems with sort of religious themes, but nothing religious particularly about them in the old way. Dared to take on T.S. Eliot by writing one called Ash Wednesday in his quatrains. Raisin bran, not pancakes, for Fat Tuesday breakfast. Then wish knee-jerk alleluias, happy trails. It's time for packing up the glad rags, peeling magic tape off backs of Christmas cards left dangling on the doorframe past their prime, and burning strings from last year's palms in the pantry sink. The cracked spears yielded to the sacristan for ash, to be smeared on foreheads of a mob in cruciform, the logo of a fierce imperial army branded on their brows. Quick flash. Nuns with smudges in the Irish slums, penitents in sack at the cathedral door, red-faced sissy in the public school, in shirt of candy stripes with Fruit Loop yanked by hoods, embarrassed that his secret piety and far more secret wish for cool behavior have converged. Here's mud in your eye, and you forgot to wash your face. Hold back. You can't take on the world. Deep breath and give it up for Lent. Turn it over like the 45s with giant holes, whose flip sides soothed when hit songs played to death lost their fizz. The background music of a life indelible and unremarkable as breakfast food. There's a trip to take whose sights invigorate the more they drop away. Dust accumulating on its own is different from dust on furniture. To see, turn off the lights. And the last poem I'm going to read is sort of anthem to AA. Called Powerless. I was a mess. I felt like crying all the time. No matter what I said, how charming I would try to be, my friends, old friends I thought I could depend on, looked at me like I was crazy or depraved. They were the ones I'd called for years, on mornings after blackouts I perceived as rip-roaring adventures. What happened? Was I too outrageous? These days, the answer was obviously yes. But I was powerless to stop. I didn't know the drinking was the cause. I thought it was the upshot of the sad departure of my looks and mind and hope and friends and gifts and sense that anything could ever feel other than stripped of joy and dropped into the sea in concrete overshoes again. I was dying, lying in a bed I couldn't even lure a hustler into, in a rock and roll motel on Santa Monica, where madness partied all night by the pool and Tom Waits used to live. A place I thought was cool to stay, I stayed at, though I didn't feel so hot when I awoke to light that made me want to vomit, reaching for the bud I'd passed out next to, thinking that if I could choke down last night's beer, it was a form of completion at a time when I could never finish anything, and couldn't even step back from the panic anymore with a drink to make me think my pain was my participation in the life of poetry I'd chosen. I wanted to be stoic at the lot I'd drawn by being such an artist. I wanted to be captain of my soul, but I was out of control at the helm of a scow I'd steered into the rocks, horrified to watch its cargo of self-involved self-pity poison the environment I loved. I couldn't stop the dark from spreading, couldn't plug the leaks, couldn't scrub the filth away, and it was all my fault. Then something odd happened. I woke up in my motel room in the middle of the night. No one else was there, but I had the strongest sense that somebody was with me, sitting on the bed, in fact. It was as if my hand were being held. I thought of that old film, The Haunting, where something similar happens to Julie Harris. But this wasn't scary. I lay there and felt myself surrounded by the presence of the gentlest, most compassionate and loving person, I'm not sure, that I had ever known. There was no hand that I could see, but I clung to it. There was no voice as such, and yet I clearly heard the words, "Everything will be all right." I wondered if this could be a visit from the Virgin Mary, the kind I always wanted as a kid. I was surprised how calm and undramatic it all was. I let the love wash over me until I fell asleep again. The next day was Mother's Day. I made a call and went to my first meeting a few blocks away. I'd been wondering where all the healthy, handsome people in West Hollywood had disappeared to. I found out. An old guy with a shaven head and 20 years spoke first. He said, "I say 2 prayers each morning. The first is thank you. The second is don't let me fuck this up." I say those prayers today. These things took place 5 years ago. I didn't dream them up or make them happen. I was powerless to change the horror and the shame that had infected my whole life. I know that they were lifted by the power of whatever held my hand that night. This is not about religion, not about belief. I know what happened. I was there. It was there. Nothing can change that